Welcome back, primates, to An Ape's Guide to Human Language. This time around, we are focusing on eyes. To label some parts of the visible eye, we have the pupil, the dark hole in the middle where the light enters the eye so that it can be detected by the retina. The iris, a colorful tissue structure that is involved in changing the tension of the lens so that we can focus. And then the sclera around the outside, that is the large visible surface that wraps all the way around, even though we can only see a small part of it from the front. Our group has already had a go at structure function analysis using these two pictures. So at the top here, we have a non-human primate with a pair of eyes very visible from this direction. And down below, we have a human primate. And we've been trying to figure out what are the visible differences that we can observe between their eye structures, and also what might be the functional correlates of those visible differences. So some of our groups identified differences in the size and prominence of the brow ridge, and formulated hypotheses that had to do with protection of the eyes from the elements, from falling objects, and potentially protecting them from light, meaning that they are better hidden and gaze may be kept secret. Some of our teams also went on to suggest that the very visible nature of the human eye might have something to do with choosing to communicate using gaze. So we're going to talk about these featural differences and what evidence we have from the anatomy of different species to support or refute these hypotheses. So here we have three different primates illustrated with the shape and structure of their eye clearly visible. So we have the pupil, the iris, and the sclera. And from just these visible features, we can measure the width to height ratio of the visible area of the eye. And we can measure the visible area of the sclera relative to the visible area of the eye. And we can see just with these three examples that the differences are quite pronounced. So width to height ratio differs radically between different primates. So does sclera size and orientation. Our curious ape might be wondering why. Well, Kobayashi and Koshima conducted a large-scale study where they compared the width to height ratio and the sclera size index of a ton of different primates. When they ranked them according to the width to height ratio, what they found was the earlier in the evolutionary tree the primates branched, so here we have lemurs, followed by New World monkeys, followed by Old World monkeys, followed by apes. The earlier that primate species branched, the rounder their eyes. So the width to height ratio here is very narrow. When they looked at the sclera size index, a different pattern tended to emerge. The sclera size index is radically different for humans compared to others in our lineage. So these two features might have different jobs. We're going to look first at width to height ratio. So when they measured width to height ratio across a bunch of different primates and then compared the habitats of those primates, a very clear pattern emerged that those primates that are arboreal have smaller width to height ratios. So that indicates these are primates with rounder eyes. Those primates that are semi-arboreal are fairly similar, but tending to move in the direction of terrestrial primates who on average have eyes that are very wide relative to their height. Why might this be? We might want to understand, what is it about living on the ground that makes your eyes wider? Well, they also studied the amount of time and the frequency with which a bunch of primates spent looking in which direction. So they measured the amount of time spent looking side to side and the number of different times that they looked from side to side. And it turns out that terrestrial primates spend a lot more time looking in the horizontal plane. Now, this makes sense if you think about the way that an arboreal primate moves around in the forest. They might have to look in a wide variety of directions to find their next tree branch. But if you are limited to the plane that is the ground, then as you are finding your path and deciding where you will go next, then your gaze will be horizontal as a response to the landscape that you're moving around in. When they ran a correlation between the actual width of each individual primate's eyes and the amount of time they spent doing horizontal looking, they found that these were very tightly correlated. So if you are a primate that needs to do a lot of horizontal looking, you are very likely to have very wide eyes. If you are a primate that needs to do looking in a wider variety of directions, then you are very likely to have very round eyes. So the shape, the visible morphology of the eye aperture is tied to habitat quite directly. They followed this up with an investigation of how the visible area of the sclera relates to the primate's body size in terms of their height, how high above the ground or how high above a surface they are. And again, they find quite a strong correlation with taller primates showing more visible sclera. In addition, primates that have more visible sclera tend to turn their head less. So even though they look horizontally more of the time, they can do so without moving their head as much. So this gave rise for Kobayashi and Koshima to the idea that perhaps the evolution of the eye allowed an adaptation from gaze camouflaging to gaze signaling. So the idea here is that just by living on the ground and spending more of our time looking horizontally than in other directions, we got our wide eyes. But those eyes can have more value to us if they also have white sclera. And that white sclera, the adaptive nature of it, comes only because we already have wide eyes. In a fascinating follow-up, it turns out that this may be a very active process that's ongoing. So in studies that have investigated different kinds of gorilla populations, it turns out that the likelihood of having white sclera differs between different communities of gorillas. And in a review of photographic evidence of the eyes of different kinds of gorillas, Mayhew and Gomez have established when humans are head-on, humans have a much larger area visible than all gorillas combined. However, when gorillas are not looking straight at the camera, but rather looking in a different direction, humans have the largest amount of visible sclera showing, followed by lowland gorillas, followed by highland gorillas. Now, these two populations of gorillas live in different habitats, and they have adapted to their habitats in different ways. The highland gorillas live in a much more jungle-like environment, whereas the lowland gorillas live in wide open plains where looking in the horizontal plane is more of an advantage. So our curious ape might want to know whether or not they can make use of these kinds of eye gaze cues. Can you tell where someone is looking just by the direction of their eye gaze? Can you pay attention in ways that are useful to you? So this is a study by Tomasello and his lab that compares the performance of human infants with the performance of some different captive apes. So the study involves a person walking into a room where the other primate is present, and then pausing and looking at something on the ceiling. The y-axis up the side measures the proportion of respondents who followed the gaze to try and see if there was something there on the roof, something that was capturing the attention. Now, for human infants, when they're only 1 year of age, if both the head and the eyes are pointed towards the ceiling, we get a pattern of responding that shows around a quarter of the infants are detecting this cue. What's fascinating, though, is if the visitor to the room has their head tilted towards the ceiling, but not their eyes, we don't see this pattern of responding. In a third condition, the visitor to the room looks towards the ceiling, but without moving their head. And by 18 months of age, our human infants are starting to show selective attention to eye gaze in the absence of a head point. And then in the fourth condition, we have the neutral condition where a human enters the room and neither their head nor their eyes are pointing towards the ceiling. So we can see this is kind of like our just noise condition, general accidental interest in the ceiling. By contrast, when we look at a group of African apes of a variety of different kinds in exactly the same scenario, we see a very different pattern of behavior. We don't see a developmental trajectory where it takes children some time to focus in on the eyes, but that the eyes alone are a stable cue. Instead, if the head and the eyes together are pointed at the ceiling, we get a very high success rate, around 50%. Look at the target location. When the head is pointed but the eyes are not, we get a lot of false positives. So around 35% of the respondents are behaving as though there is something of interest to look at. And then when it is just the eyes in the absence of a head point, this cue is not salient for these apes. So this has led Tomasello to make the proposal of the cooperative eye hypothesis. And this is the idea that the evolution of highly visible eyes implies that humans expect cooperative behavior from each other and have evolved to interpret each other's eye gaze in helpful ways. One test of the cooperative eye hypothesis involves a human coming into an arena with another animal and pointing at one of two target locations. So here we have a target on this side or a target on this side, one of which contains a food reward. And the question one might ask is, over the course of 16 encounters with a human where the animal is encouraged to come up to the front for a reward here, and is then given an instruction of where a reward is hidden behind them, either this location in red or this location in green. Out of 16 attempts at this game, how often will this animal correctly infer the location of the food reward, even if they are told its location by pointing? It turns out that chimpanzees are not very good at interpreting the gestures of a human who is pointing to a food reward. It's almost as though this chimp either cannot understand the gesture or has no reason to trust that it is actually a helpful one. By contrast, dogs perform much better on this task. Now, this barrier versus no barrier is a small difference in the way that the experimental setup was designed. Initially, it was performed for the dogs without any screen between the human and the dog, and there was a thought there that this was so different from the primate condition that perhaps the reason the chimps had failed was because of the experimental setup instead. So the experiment was redone, this time with no barrier between the chimpanzee and the human pointer, and the dogs still outperform the chimpanzees. So there's something about dogs who trust the veracity of a pointing gesture more than chimpanzees. However, we shouldn't take these results at face value. There has been some kind of conflicting evidence. And if you refer back to some of our animal narratives that are in the content section on NTU Learn, there are conflicting accounts that lots of chimpanzees do in fact use cooperative gesturing, both within their species and also with humans, gesturing for where a human can help a chimpanzee get a treat, or gesturing to each other for certain social interactions. So, and yet, even with that caveat, it seems that non-human primates don't seem to be paying attention to eye gaze cues in the same way. And maybe there's something else we need to think about for why humans are so good at making use of eye gaze cues. So I'll take us back to a fundamental theory about the way that humans process faces. And this goes back to the early 90s, to the con-spec, con-learn model of facial processing. And the idea here is that infants, even on the first day of their birth, are innately attracted to look at face-like stimuli, even if it's not a very good face. So we can see some examples here of some not very good faces. Human infants, even in the first few hours after being born, will orient their gaze to things that look like this or this much more frequently than things that look like this or like this. So this is like an instinct. This is something that children are born ready to do. One of the theories is that this promotes bonding with caregivers, which of course is going to be very important if you're going to survive as a human infant. But it also promotes the opportunity to learn particular configurations of physiological information. Now, if we're going to learn configurations of physiological information, we might want to think about the structure of the physiological information we are learning. So human infants are born with an instinct to look at faces and a powerful learning capacity. Here's one neat example that very early on in a human infant's life, the ability to learn configurations of faces is very plastic. So at 6 months of age, if children are shown one bunch of monkey faces, like these top row monkeys up here, and then later on they're tested on a different bunch of monkey faces, like these ones down here, do they have the ability to figure out whether a face that they're seeing is a new one or an old one? At 6 months of age, babies can very easily pick out the differences between these two stimuli. By the time that they're 9 months of age, they've lost that ability. And by the time they're adults, they really struggle at this task. However, if children of exactly the same age with exactly the same background are given some daily training with pictures of these primate faces, then at this age, 9 months, where in the untrained condition, they failed to tell apart the different monkeys. In the 9-month-old group, these babies can very easily detect the differences that they're being asked to. So this is telling us that the facial configuration is enough to attract attention. And if we are exposed to faces that share a particular configuration, like human versus this kind of monkey, then we're able to extract configural information from the learning environment. We've seen statistical learning before, right? In our last mini lectures, we saw statistical learning for the distribution of particular speech sounds. And that was what allowed us to extract phoneme categories. So clearly this learning process, the statistical learning process, is one that can function in a variety of different domains. We might also want to check whether or not this learning process is something that is truly instinctual, or the ability to make use of gaze information, whether it's instinctual or whether it arises from our experience in the world. So this is a study in which a human face appears on a screen in the middle, and there are 2 possible target locations for something very exciting to appear. The face looks at one of these target locations first, and the test is whether or not the children will follow the gaze of the viewer in the center of the screen in order to get that reward of the very exciting thing appearing on the screen, or will they look randomly? So this test was conducted with a bunch of different aged babies who had different visual experience at the same gestational age. So the first group were babies who were carried to term and then spent 4 months out in the real world where they could view faces. The second group were a group who were full term and had spent 7 months out in the real world where they could view faces. The third group were born 3 months early. So in gestational age, they're the same age as group A. However, they've been out in the world for 7 months. So the time from conception, gestational age 4 months, is the same for A and C. But the amount of visual experience they've had with faces is the same as group B. The fourth group is the group of children who were born very early and have been out in the world for a bit longer, which puts them at the same gestational age as group B. So premature infants with the same gestational age as group B or group A. So over here, we can see the results for what proportion of gazers in this eye tracking study were following the gaze of the viewer in the screen. And we can see that for group A, who were carried to term and out in the world for 4 months, it's 50%. They're not very good at following the gaze cue. Just another 3 months later, they're a lot better. So group B has better performance than group A. Group C, who is the same gestational age as group A, is performing like group B, which is the group who have been out in the world for just as long. So what this tells us, the similarity between these two bars, is that it's the amount of time that your eyes have been out in the open that predicts your gaze following behavior, not how physiologically mature you are from the time of gestation. So this is telling us that it's experience with faces that gives us this skill. Now it seems like following eye gaze is even more powerful than just the ability to extract directional information. In fact, you might be wondering why in a class on language we're spending all of this time focusing on eyes. But there's some really fascinating data looking at gaze followers, or early gaze followers and late gaze followers. So in this longitudinal study, kids were tracked over 2 years of age and their vocabulary increases were monitored. And they were classified according to whether they were a child who tended to follow gaze a lot or follow gaze very little. And it turns out, if this is the measurement of how many words does a child say, and this is the age of the child, it turns out that those gaze followers who are in a test of their gaze following ability showed the highest performance, those kids have larger vocabularies. Kids who follow gaze less have lower vocabularies. This is in an American monolingual sample. How could this be? How can following people's gaze give us more words? Well, it might have something to do with tying together eye gaze and labeling. So in this lovely study, where children were sat across the table from an adult, they were shown two objects that are unfamiliar. And one of them was going to be labeled. So the labeling goes like this. The adult across the table says, "It's a Perry. I'm going to hide the Perry. Can you find the Perry?" So the first labeling event is when the object is in full view of the learner, after which they hide it. They hide both objects, and then the child is asked to identify which one was the Perry. Now, the trick in this study is that the adult waits to name the Perry until the child is looking at something else. So the labeling event occurs when the child is looking at a different object from the adult. So there are two kind of strategies you could use in this situation as a learner. You could focus on the speaker's gaze at the moment of labeling, or you could focus on your own, the listener's gaze at the moment of learning. And what we see in this study is for typically developing 2-year-olds, the majority of children are focusing their attention to the object that the speaker was looking at, or at least they're mapping the label to the object that the speaker was looking at, not the object that they were looking at. By contrast, children with autism who treat gaze quite differently, even as late as 7 years of age, have a different strategy. It's more 50-50, but they have a slightly higher tendency to assume that the labeled object was the one that they were looking at, not the one that the speaker was looking at. So this ties in together these two streams of evidence we've been looking at. The fact that more visible sclera might give us more available clues in terms of where people are looking And if people label things when they're looking at them, and we know what they're looking at, then our ability to learn labels for things is enhanced. Now, earlier on, we also saw an example about pointing and the study where humans were pointing to different food rewards for chimpanzees and dogs. So we should probably ask ourselves the question of, when do children learn about pointing? This is a lovely study that combines pointing, eye gaze, and labeling all together with babies. And in this study, the speaker would look at one object, point at another, and label. So obviously, there are two possible strategies. You could assume that the label goes with the gaze object, in this case, the little elephant. Or you could assume that the label goes with the point object, in this case, the sheep, monkey. Oh, I think it's a monkey. What was observed was that it takes some time for the patterns to stabilize. So the youngest babies prefer the gaze object. So after the labeling event has occurred, the speaker goes away, the child hears the name of the object, and they can look freely at either of these in this eye tracking study, right? The youngest babies tend, on average, to orient their gaze to the object that was gazed at during labeling, which is just like the fast mapping that we saw over here with typical toddlers. By 2 years of age, there's been a flip. The 2-year-olds are now starting to look at the one that was pointed at, because there's something about pointing that these kids have learnt to interpret. And this continues as well with adults. If people say, banana, oh no, I've done it wrong, banana, you might assume that there's a banana over here because you and I together know about pointing. So that early tendency to match linguistic labels to eye gaze positioning is overridden by a different kind of social behavior. So let's bring it back to what this might get us as a species, not just as a human infant. In Kobayashi and Hayashi's paper, they brought up a secondary suggestion, not so much that eye gaze is cooperative, as in Tomasello's suggestion, but that eye gaze can be used as a kind of grooming behavior. By making eye contact and following each other's eye contact, we can understand more about each other's social and emotional states, and maybe we can use that effectively in the ways that we interact with each other. So they did a study that compared the width to height ratio of different primates with two things: the neocortex ratio, which we will come back to later in the semester, and the group size. And what's fascinating about this finding is that this second measurement here is the sclera size index. So the proportion of the visible eye that is devoted to sclera. And both of these measurements correlate with the size of a primate's group. So this is telling us that there's something really important about having wide eyes with visible sclera that allows you to perform social functions with your conspecifics that are enhanced, which allows you to have larger group sizes. So humans pay a lot of attention to each other's gaze, and this allows efficient learning of cultural information, like the mapping between forms or spoken words and their meanings. And all of this eye gaze behavior seems to help with social grooming. which allows us to have larger group sizes. How can a primate get this advantage? Well, if you need your sclera to be more visible, you're going to need wider eyes to enhance your lateral gaze, and sclera pigmentation that helps your eyes become more visible. To get wider eyes, you're going to need to spend less time in trees, stand at a taller height, spend more time in open grassland, where your height advantage will allow you to see in the horizontal plane more effectively. But being out in the grassland sounds really dangerous, right? There might be predators. How can I stay safe in the open plains? You might need a bigger group size for your own protection. So it's a good thing that upgrading your eyes will help groom other members of your species and help you to stay safe in your new wide-eyed habitat. So that brings us to the end of this little unit of anatomical relationships between the structures that we can see in our bodies and the functions that they have, and how those might be related in really interesting ways to language. And if you recall our card deck and the Go Ape game we played at the very beginning of semester, you'll notice that we've talked about all of the properties this week that might be related to habitat change. We've talked about terrestrial limbs, we've talked about upright spines, and we've talked about these terrestrial eyes. So as we go along in the next couple of weeks, we'll be continuing through these different cascades of evolutionary adaptation that may have in some way put us on the path to language, even though that's not how these changes began. So I'll see you next time.